Right. Hello, everyone, and happy Wednesday afternoon. If you're watching us live, if you're watching us later, whatever day it is, I hope you're having a good one. So thanks for joining us for our college and career workshop that happens every week, same time, same place here. And we just try to share skills and resources for you to think about what your journey is going to be after high school, or even what you can do while you're still in school to kind of set yourself up for success. Um, so I'm really excited about our guest speaker that we have today. We have Theresa Cuenca from the University of Oregon Career Center, and she's going to talk to us all about all the stuff you need to know. You're going to know everything at the end of this. So yeah, tune in, take some notes if you'd like. We'll make this presentation available afterwards. The other thing I want to remind everyone is that as you're watching from YouTube, there is a little chat box off to the side. Please feel free to write us any questions you have at any point during the presentation. It's not going to interrupt us. We have our college mentors on the back end collecting all of your questions, and we will ask those at the end. So anything you think of at any point, drop it in there. We'll get you some answers. We have some time set aside. So please utilize this for the resource that it is. All right, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Theresa. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Megan. I love that intro. I will try to disperse all knowledge, but at least for today, this will be focused on high school students in particular, and also resume building as a focus. So this particular presentation, I hope, gives you some good tips and guidance as you think about your resume building path as a high school student. So the first thing I'd like to do is introduce my title. I'm calling it Mythbusters 101, How to Create a Path to Career Success, hopefully without losing your mind. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. And as was mentioned by Megan, as you all have questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat. All right, so I'm going to give a little overview of my presentation with you this afternoon. So the first thing that I'm going to discuss are 5 myths, and we're going to spend some time busting down those myths together. We'll talk a little bit about how to craft your ever-evolving resumes, and I'll give you some good information and some good guidance with some sample resume ideas. Again, focused in particular with high school students. And then we'll close out this afternoon session talking a little bit about the power of networking, informational interviews, and then also job shadowing. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my very first myth for high school students. So let's start out with number 1. So myth 1, a resume is a very scary document, and I should only attempt one when I know what I want to do with my life. So giant spoiler alert, no one actually ever knows what they want to do with their life. You might have various ideas and different career paths and different scenarios that you're interested in, but no one knows exactly how it's all going to go. So what do you have to do? Basically, you just have to start. So for everyone, a resume is a living document, and it's going to grow with you as you grow in your career journey. It's never too early to start a resume, and it's also never too late to update or edit or change your resume. As your experience grows and as your goals solidify, your information is going to grow, your experiences are going to expand, even the different types of fields and career paths you're interested in are going to grow and expand with you. So your resume is really a living document. It's not carved in stone. If you are a typical high school student, college student, young adult, you may end up with 10 or 20 different resumes throughout your career journey. A good thing to note, no one has ever started off with a perfect resume. You just have to start. It's like any other type of writing exercise. It feels daunting until you first get your first words on the page. After that, it does get easier. You do learn kind of tips and tricks of the trade. And after you've established one resume, the next one, and the next one, and the next one will be easier to build. When you're in your resume building process, which again might be a varied process throughout your career journey, it's always a good idea to get fresh eyes on your resume. As you grow and build in your career skills, your resume is going to grow and build with you, and you want other people making sure that you're getting the information across that you want to. That's a tip for both adults and high school students. All right, I'm going to jump into myth number 2. So this is in particular, again, with the high school student population. So myth 2, I don't have anything to put on my resume because I don't yet have any employment. This could be the situation for a lot of you this afternoon. So let's bust this myth wide open. So a resume does not only need to include your employment or paid work experience. A resume is really a way to showcase your skills, your experience, and also what you might bring to the table or bring to a job or a career field. So what do you put on a resume if you don't yet have any paid work experience? Anything that you can showcase that falls into volunteer work, leadership positions, certificate programs, scholarships, and even some specific coursework is relevant experience. So we'll kind of break down different parts of this as I go through this presentation. But really, as you're thinking about your quote unquote work experience, try to get out of the mindset that it needs to be paid work experience. All of these types of opportunities show that you have gotten yourself out there, you've been engaged with other humans, you've been involved in your community, and you've focused on job skills as you're going through your high school experience. So as you're crafting your resume, especially if you're focusing on volunteer work or leadership positions, the way you frame this information is really key. So I'm going to give you an example of kind of a very typical high school experience, a high school volunteer experience, babysitting. So in this case, this is a student who has done a ton of babysitting for years and years with their local church. So what would be a good way to frame this in terms of how are you setting yourself up for those career skills? So a way to frame it could be experienced childcare provider, First United Methodist Church. So in this example, the student could say, I provide experienced care to children ages 3 to 9 with a focus on engagement, community building, and safety. CPR certified with an emphasis on child CPR. So that is also adding that certificate that shows a very real world skill that could be required for some work positions as well. So that is a way to frame a type of volunteer experience, a very typical high school experience, without needing it to have been a paid work experience. Another example that is also very common in high school would be if you have a role that requires responsibility within a student organization, within a student club, within an extracurricular activity. So here's an example of a student who was a member of their National Honor Society at the South Eugene High School. And we're going to talk about how they worked within leadership roles in that position or that volunteer position. So this student wrote, progressed from active member to volunteer coordinator to officer for my high school. Increased my responsibility in team building, coordination, and organizational skills. So again, this is a volunteer activity. This is a student organization. This is an experience that wasn't a paid work experience, but these types of skills, team building, coordination, organizational skills, these are all real world work skills that could be needed for future employment. So these are going to give you a couple of ideas about how to frame your volunteer and student organization experiences. Okay, so let's delve a little bit deeper into the world of volunteer experiences and really break down some myths there. So, myth number 3, my volunteer experience doesn't count because it's not part of a formal organization. So, this is a very common myth. So, in your experience as a high school student, you may have various different ways that you've had volunteer experience. And it can all be framed as showcasing valuable work skills for future employment. So a good example for many high school students would be tutoring. And this could be informal tutoring, maybe to your friend group, or this could be more formal tutoring if you're part of a club at your school or something like that. So for this example, I'm going to use a student who did some informal tutoring with their friend group, but with a very specific focus. So in this case, this student did SAT tutoring with their friend group. So a way to frame it in your resume to showcase those work skills could be experienced SAT tutor, South Eugene. So this is current information on a resume. So provide experienced tutoring to juniors and seniors preparing to take the SATs, individualized tutoring based on specific needs and goals. Provide tutoring to 5 to 7 students. So this, again, it's a volunteer experience. It's not paid labor, but it's using those future work skills. It's always great to highlight a certain number, if you can, that shows a certain number of people you worked with, a certain number of students you were involved with, maybe a goal that you reached during that volunteer experience, if there was a certain percentage of success. Numbers on a resume are something eye-catching that someone can refer back to. Again, to continue a little bit more deeply with this specific example, if you had increased responsibility in a volunteer position or opportunity, you could also frame that and add that in your wording for your resume. So again, to follow through with this example, this student as an SAT tutor took initiative to familiarize themselves with the latest SAT prep guides from the Princeton Review, worked on tailoring their tutoring to specific skills needed after feedback from students and parents. So this is a very specific skill set that the student is showcasing, and how they framed it is really what makes it appropriate for a student resume at this point. All right, I'm going to go on to myth number 4. Okay, so myth number 4, again, very common for high school students. So nobody cares about my high school coursework or my extracurricular activities. These are kind of 2 myths in one. So if you are thinking about your overall resume and you have very specific coursework that you think those skills might help you in a future work position, it is absolutely relevant information to include in a resume. Anything that shows that you are focusing in on a specific type of work skill is relevant. So I'll give an example of a student who was focusing on a photography course for their resume. So this is a student who took a photography 2 course, and how would they frame it on their resume? So under relevant coursework, they could list photography 2, experienced in wide angle lens photography, darkroom processing, and Nikon 360 cameras. I made up that camera. I don't know if that camera actually exists, but it sounded good. So this is just an example. So this is a way to showcase coursework that you actually had in high school that is proving in a resume some real world experience, especially for the future career. So in this case, photography is a broad skill that could be used in a range of future careers. Absolutely relevant info to put in a resume. And as you're thinking of other classes, other electives, other coursework that you find those skills very interesting, especially as you move into the career field or the workforce, very relevant info to put on your resume. Again, focusing on skills. A next part of this myth in terms of extracurricular activities. So experiential education is kind of a buzzword these days. Basically, it's education that happens outside of the classroom. So in this case, I'm going to take an example for a student who is applying to be a counselor for outdoor school. And maybe they don't have previous work experience, but what could they list on their resume? So this is an example of skills that they could list under experiential education. So avid hiker with intermediate wildflower identification skills and advanced reptile identification. So again, this is an activity outside of the classroom. It's not a volunteer experience. It's not a paid work experience. It's just an extracurricular activity the student is involved in. And they're showing skills in terms of actual specific skills that could be useful in the type of position they're applying for. So again, in the framing of it, you really want to highlight those things that would be useful in the types of work positions that you may be applying for. And who knew that hiking could be a relevant skill on a resume, but absolutely could for outdoor school. And then another example focusing on extracurricular activities. So for this student, this is a student who is an athlete in high school, and how can they frame those skills from being an athlete? So under extracurricular activities, they could list JV soccer team, 3 years, and then here are the skills: practice team building, goal setting, and mentoring of younger players. So again, real world work experiences will be looking for those type of skills moving forward as you're applying for a position. And going back to the numbers and how those can be more memorable for a resume, someone reading this resume will see that they had that continued experience as a student athlete, focusing on those team building skills. All right, I'm going to go to my 5th myth, and then we'll look at some resume samples. Okay, so myth number 5, and this is a good myth for anyone, not just high school students. Only a professional should review my resume. This is a giant, giant myth. So anyone can help you review your resume. Anyone who has another idea about you, either as a student, as a volunteer, maybe as someone they've worked with in the community, they might have good ideas and thoughts on how to frame different experiences in your resume. Always a great idea to get a second set, a third set, a fourth set, a fifth set of eyes. Sometimes you will stare at your resume for so long that you just won't even see when you've written an error. You kind of go blind to reading your resume after you've stared at it for maybe 25 job applications. So it's always helpful to get someone else's eyes on it and to get multiple people's eyes on it, really. So just ask, ask people that you've had either a course with, or someone that you've met out in the community, or someone that you trust at your high school, just someone else to take another look for you. And if you think about it, if you are helpful to someone, they are more likely to be helpful to you as well. So if someone else is looking at their resume, volunteer to take a look at theirs as well. Anything that you can do to make it a win-win situation is helpful. I Get By With a Little Help from My Friends is a great song to think about as you're moving through this career journey. Again, this isn't just relevant to high school students. This is a good tip for any adult anywhere. If you can help someone else out with their documents, they're more likely to help you out with your documents too. Another reason why it's so important to get a fresh set of eyes on it are our technologies can't really replace the second check or the third check or the fourth check by an actual human being. So when you're typing up a document in Word, Word will find a few glaring spelling errors. Word will find a few glaring grammatical errors, but it misses a ton. I can't tell you how many times I open up a document in Word and it will catch maybe a fifth of the errors in the technology. It also can't give you any feedback on formatting or the overall look or the overall tone or how does your overall resume present itself. So definitely seek out humans even as you're using those technologies to make it a little bit easier. And then final tip, proofread, 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 and then proofread some more. So if you have seen Friends as a series or you're rewatching Friends, there's a great storyline where Rachel is applying for jobs and she prints out 100 resumes and someone notices that there's a typo and she goes, "Do you think it's on everyone?" And yes, it is on everyone. So proofread, proofread, proofread. Okay, so that is it for the myths. And then I'm going to go into some sample ideas for how you build and craft your resume without any work experience, paid work experience. So I'm going to give you an example of a really great high school resume. There are different sections in a resume. There are certain sections that are absolutely required no matter what type of job you are applying for. And then there are some sections of a resume that are optional sections, and it can kind of be based on what types of career fields you're applying for. And then I'll give you some ideas and examples of some not so great resumes so you can learn from those as well. So let's start with a great example of a high school resume. So this is going to be a really good example of a student who doesn't yet have any professional paid employment history. So the first thing you start off with are what we call the bread and butter of the resume. These points of the resume are non-negotiables. You have to include them no matter what type of career or job you're applying for. So you have to include your name. The biggest font, the boldest font should be your name. That's going to be the most important part of your entire resume document. And it is important to include your full name. So even if in your personal life you go by Jen or Jenny, on a resume, it would be most appropriate to include Jennifer as your full name. The second thing you'll want to do is include a contact phone number. Make sure whichever phone number you include, that it's not one that has an embarrassing voicemail message. There's lots of examples of what not to have on your voicemail message. And then include a contact email. And again, this would not be the time to have an embarrassing email address that maybe you chose when you were 12. Maybe it's time to get a second email address that is just for your professional email correspondence, something with just your name or something simple. And then an optional part of a resume is what's called a resume objective. This is a paragraph that works really well if you have a very specific job in mind. So if you are doing a resume and a job application for, let's say, a job specifically, this one is an internship, a resume objective would be a great thing to include in this type of resume. If you're doing a more broadly based resume and it's not for a very specific job or very specific type of job, a resume objective may not be the most useful thing for you. But I'll give you this example as it's a really well-written resume objective for a high school student. So responsible and ambitious student, a 3.8 out of a 4.0 GPA, with excellent time management. Oh, and then I can't actually You might have to read this part on your own because I can't actually see the rest of the paragraph because I see these boxes in Zoom. But the way that this resume objective is written is geared specifically towards this particular internship program. So again, this is for a very specific job application. And it doesn't have to be a very lengthy paragraph, but it's highlighting this student's educational background and their current work skills. Okay, go on to the next part. So then another standard part of your resume, and usually the part that you include after your contact information, would be your education piece. So in this case, for this student, they're a high school student at Heritage High School in Charleston, South Carolina. They're a senior, and then because they have such a high GPA, they've listed it here as a point of recognition. If you have a less than stellar GPA, it's not a requirement on your resume to include. And right off the bat, they've listed relevant coursework, especially as it is relevant to this business internship that they are applying for. So they've listed 3 classes here that would have very real world applicable skills: Intro to Business, Entrepreneurship, and Computer Applications. Definitely skills that could be used in this type of business internship. And then they are going to go into their volunteer experience. So again, this is a high school student who doesn't have any employment experience. So they're going to start off with volunteer experience. So this first example is a current volunteer experience that is ongoing. So they list here that they work at the volunteer at the MUSC Children's Hospital. They're an information desk assistant. They've been doing that since 2018, and they're still doing it, so through the present. And then they list 3 different types of activities that they're involved in as part of their volunteer experience. So they greet hospital patients and visitors, they provide guidance, they process mail, and they assist wheelchair-bound patients. The next volunteer experience is a previous volunteer experience. So it's important to note in a resume, you usually go in reverse chronological order. So you'll start with your most recent experience first and then work your way backwards. So their past volunteer experience was at a homeless shelter. And again, they list the time frame that they volunteered there. And this is a good example where they've listed numbers to get people to think about their contributions and what they accomplished. So they were talking about a canned food drive that was very successful and the amount of food that they collected. They talk about they assisted in biweekly meal preparation. So the person reading this resume knows that that was an activity that they were involved in frequently. And then they also had a plan that they developed that helped reduce monthly food waste by 15%. So again, highlighting a success that they had within that volunteer experience and showing it in a concrete percentage, which makes it easy to remember. So when you are writing your current experiences, again, start with your most recent first and then work your way backwards, and make sure that if you're writing about previous experiences that you write them in the past tense and include any specific numbers and any specific goals that you can. So then the last sections of the student's resume are focusing on extracurricular activities and additional skills that they have. So these types of positions, so for instance, this student was president of the Model UN and secretary of the Student Council. Those show leadership positions. And then they were also a member of the National Honor Society. So again, team building and leadership would be inferred skills within those leadership and extracurricular activities. And then additional skills, especially ones that would be relevant to the workforce. So they list a second language and they list their level of that language, in this case, Spanish, conversational level. They list their typing skills and how many words per minute they can type. They list their technological capabilities, so in this case, Google Suite. They list customer service skills, probably gained through their volunteer experiences. And then they list public speaking as an additional skill. So again, these are all things that would be relevant to the workforce and to future positions that they might be applying for. And this is really a good example. This on when you have it on a Word document, this is about a one-page resume and a good example of a high school student who's listing their volunteer, their extracurricular, and their additional skills as their experiences. The very final section they included were focused on awards and honors. So then this is also getting at kind of experiences that are outside of the classroom. So this student is a National Merit Scholarship finalist. They were on the academic honor roll, and then they received a community service award from the Future Business Leaders of America. So this whole resume is focusing on experiences and skills the student has gained during high school. A note about as you are beginning to craft your resume, there are a lot of resume templates out there. Microsoft Word has a lot of free resume templates. It's really important to note that the more complex the template, the more difficult it is to edit, to really change up the look, and to really do any modifications to it. So as you are looking at templates, especially if you're crafting your first initial resume, a good idea is to really keep it simple. The more you have to play with, the more chances you have of formatting getting off and things just not really looking right or flowing on the page. So when you're looking at templates, simple is better. And I was going to give you a note of caution about a resume. I had a student that I was working with who I had been working with them as a college student, and then they applied for a student worker position. And this student was a graphic design student. And when I opened up their resume, I thought, wow, what a stellar looking resume. It was this absolutely beautiful document. In their graphic design skills, they had this kind of watercolor background. It was a very vibrant and colorful and aesthetically appealing, beautiful document. And then I read their resume. And in their skills of trying to make this document look pretty, they'd forgotten their bread and butter, their non-negotiables. The student had their name in very bold, big font, and then had forgotten to list a phone number. They had forgotten to list an email address. They didn't have any type of mailing address. There was zero way to communicate or contact the student. So in fact, this wasn't really a resume at all. This was just a pretty document, a pretty picture with the student's name and some of their background skills, but it wasn't in fact being useful as a resume because it didn't include any of that contact information. So in your desire to make a resume look pretty, to make it aesthetically pleasing, don't forget to really put in your bread and butter, your non-negotiables, and your contact information. Don't let the look of your resume overshadow your content. Okay. So then I want to leave you with some resources. So when you're thinking about those second set, third set, fourth set of eyes for your resume, who can be a good resource for you? So high school teachers can be a great resource, counselors, directors, coaches, volunteers, anyone who's been out in the workforce who's had to craft their own resume is a good second set of eyes. Parents, I know sometimes it can be embarrassing to go to your parent, but your parent is a second set of eyes and probably has a good editor eye as well. If you don't want to go to your parents, go to your friends' parents. If you don't want to go to them, go to your parents' friends. Find someone who has written their own resume and has been through that editing process themselves. If you do have a part-time job or you're out there in the volunteer world, ask your coworkers, ask your friends. Again, if you help them, they might be more likely to help you. And then I did include some resources here. I know I said that Google can't do all the work of a human, which is true, but there are some good tips and tricks on the web. So I've listed the Princeton Review, Resume Builder, and Indeed.com. And then I'm always a big fan of free events. So if your school has any free events, if your community has any free events, if the library has any free events, that is a great opportunity to develop your networking skills. And networking is really engaging with other humans, which is a career skill needed for any field. And so the last thing, so the power of networking, informational interviews, and job shadowing. So I'm going to give you one bonus myth just for you all. So the bonus myth, so there's a myth, not just for high school students, but for anyone, that networking is a tool most importantly used right before the job search process. This is a giant, giant myth. So as I mentioned, networking is really showing that you can engage with other humans. And networking is always, always, always valuable. It doesn't have to be a formal opportunity. So you don't have to think of, every community event or every event at the library as a formal networking experience. It could be an informal opportunity too. So if you have an older sibling and they're in college and they have a roommate, ask them, how did they get their work study position? How did they find that job in the lab? What was it that they did to get there? It's important to remember that everyone was a high school student at some point. It doesn't have to be scary. Everyone was once exactly where you are and in your shoes. A good tip is to keep it really simple. If you are interested in horticulture and landscape architecture, you could lead with that and introduce yourself and say, I see you have your own landscaping company. How did you get into that field? Something really simple that you can remember as you are meeting people in your career journey. And finally, you will be providing a network opportunity for someone else. So you will be paying it forward too. So I like to refer to J.J. Abrams, who everyone thinks as this amazing director now of Star Wars, but not everyone knows that he started out doing pre-animation work for Shrek and writing the theme song for Felicity, a TV show from a couple decades ago. So you never know who you're going to meet and who you're going to interact with, and every type of opportunity is a good networking opportunity. So I will leave you with that, and then I am ready to open it up for questions.
Theresa, thank you so much. That was really fun. I loved going through all of the different myths too. And I think totally those are, as someone who is very much into my career now, those are still some things that you come up against. So this is great foundational stuff to build your work on. So some questions are going to start popping up here. So
yeah,
question, what are some good ways to stand out from the rest of the resumes?
That's a great question. So don't just make it look pretty and then forget your phone number. A good way to start out if you don't have employment experience would be that objective paragraph. As you work in your career journey and you add more professional and paid work experiences, that introductory paragraph may not be as relevant in a resume. But when you're first starting out, that introductory paragraph about you as a student and about your skill set could be a really great way to highlight yourself.
Thought I unmuted myself. The ideal length of a resume.
Yeah, so this is a hot topic. So if you don't have a lot of experience, a one-page resume is ideal. As you move into your career experience, your resume gets longer and longer, but especially for high school students, a one-pager would be the ideal.
Nice. Okay, How do I gain experience during this harsh virtual world that we're all experiencing right now?
The question of the day. The best way you can is to simply reach out to people and reach out to organizations and ask if there is a possibility to volunteer. Um, it's hard to say no to free help. So, a lot of companies and a lot of organizations may not have a formal internship process right now or a formal like work study position, but they might love some free help. So if you can reach out to people and say you are available to volunteer your skills, that might be a way in.
Awesome. Okay, thinking about references, who should be my references?
Sorry, my phone is ringing in the background. So one thing to avoid would be anyone who is related to you. I've seen a few moms listed as references. They are not an unbiased source. So no one who's directly related to you. Anyone who has worked with you in like a club, a sport, an after school activity, an artistic environment, especially if you don't have work experience, someone who's maybe seen you in a leadership role, or even a high school counselor who's been working with you for a few years would be a great idea for a reference.
This is a little bit of a spinoff, but I have heard this question from students in the past. So I thought I would bring it back up. What should your balance be? I think often it's very tempting to ask from someone that you high level, but maybe doesn't know you as well. So what's, should you go ask your superintendent of your school, or should you ask your English teacher or, a mentor or someone? So how does it matter like who those people are?
So someone who knows you is always best, but you can always provide them information too. So as I've applied for different positions and I've asked different people to be my recommenders, I have given them like copies of my job application so they know why I'm applying for that position and what it is that I'm passionate about. So then when someone's reaching back out to them as my recommender, they're like, oh, Theresa would be great at this position because she's passionate about X, Y, and Z.
Nice. I love that. I think it's there's probably questions getting at this, but I think sometimes it's really hard to like advocate for yourself like that. So I think it's great to have little tips of how to share that information with people.
Yeah.
Okay, how does community service help with experience or fit into that?
Community service is a perfect example because the types of skills needed to be involved in community service are absolutely the types of skills needed to be involved in the workplace too. So again, when you focus on the actual skills that you're working on in that community service experience, that would be the most relevant to list in your in your resume, especially if you are involved in any type of leadership of that community service activity.
And I've got an interview question here. So, what are the best questions to ask in an interview? And then maybe for folks who don't have as much experience with interviews, um, do you get to ask questions in interviews? And what should you expect kind of in that process of being in an interview?
Yes. So most often at the very end of an interview, the committee or the person interviewing you will ask if you have any questions for them. And that's a really key point of the interview because it's a chance to show that you've done your homework. So if I was going to ask questions after an interview, I would have done my research on the organization and on the specific type of work that that organization does. And then I would ask a focused question, such as, what has been the biggest challenge during these COVID times in terms of your work in XYZ activity? So it's a way for you to show that you've researched them and a way for you to get more information about the type of work that you might be doing.
Nice. Oh, another classic question. How do I get a first job when so many jobs require experience?
Yeah, that is the chicken and the egg question for sure. And it's a question for everyone along their career journey, because every type of job requires experience, and yet you can't get that experience until you at least get your first job in that field. I'm going to go back to volunteering because I have a lot of colleagues and friends and students and family members who really have started out their first career by volunteering at that organization first. So especially as a high school student, when you may not yet be ready to be hired as an actual employee, volunteering is just a great way to get yourself known at the organization, to get your foot in the door, to show them that you're a hard worker and that you're able to learn. And a lot of those skills that you learn for that job, you learn on the job, literally as you're doing them. So even in different office environments that I've worked in, we've hired a lot of employees who start out as volunteers.
Yeah, I would absolutely second that. I've been in a couple situations where it's been maybe a really competitive job or a job that a lot of people are excited about, and the people we ultimately ended up hiring were ones that had volunteered, because that just meant that they were particularly qualified because they already kind of knew what was going on. So definitely a real thing.
Yeah.
So related, and maybe you've answered a little bit of this, but I like this question. If I'm volunteering somewhere, but I would like to work there, how do I ask to start working there / get paid?
Yes, if you find out the answer to that, please let me know, because it's really hard. It's just a conversation, and it will definitely depend on how long you've volunteered there and what the current climate of that job and organization is. So right now may not be the best time to ask organizations if they are going to be able to pay you. Maybe a year from now might be a better time, but it also depends on how much you've given to that organization. So are you volunteering there every week? Are you just volunteering there once in a while? Are you volunteering and you're clearly showing that you're able to learn and you're giving your time and energy to that type of work? Or does it seem that you're just there to only get a job? So it kind of depends on how you are showing up. And I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer to how to have that conversation, but I think timing is everything.
Nice. Okay, so kind of going back to the sort of the application process. So this question is, what's the difference between resumes and cover letters? And I might tack on that often you might run into supplemental questions too. So how do you help all of those pieces come together?
Yeah, so your typical job application will ask for at least a resume and a cover letter. And the cover letter is going to be very specific to the position and organization that you're applying for. So that again is a place where you really want to do your homework. So you are going to focus in your cover letter what it is that you would bring to that organization and why it is that you're so interested in that position in particular. And it's going to be very specific. Your resume, you can tailor it a bit differently as you're applying for positions. So for instance, in my resume, I might highlight certain things as higher up in my resume, depending on the type of position that I'm applying for. But in general, your resume doesn't change as much as a cover letter. A cover letter will be different each and every time you're applying for a new position.
And then, which ones haven't we answered here? Oh, what should I do to prepare for an interview?
These are great questions. So get your sleep, have a bottle of water nearby, have a notepad and a pen, assuming you're doing this virtually or even in person. It's actually perfectly acceptable to bring a copy of your resume and a copy of your cover letter with you and a notepad and pen to take notes. And really in the interview process, it's a good time for them to get to know you better and for you to get to know that organization better. It's also a good time to remember that they were once in your shoes and they were once on the other side of the table interviewing right where you were. So it is a nerve-wracking experience, but if you can just try to remember that everyone has been in your exact same position, it kind of makes things a little more manageable.
Nice. We had a couple more pop up here. Okay. On average, how many jobs should you apply to in order to ensure you'll get hired somewhere?
Again, there's no magic answer to that. I would say right now, the answer is that everyone is applying to more jobs than they maybe would have a year ago. And it is taking longer as people are in their career journey. I would say after college, kind of this time frame that people threw around as like a normal time frame to be job hunting was like 6 months to a year. I think now it's longer. That's probably more focused on professional positions as you're moving into the career workforce. But in terms of number of applications, I know that at least the U of O students in particular are applying for a lot more jobs currently than they probably would have needed to a year ago.
I think this is a really interesting question. So how have interviews changed now that a lot of them are virtual?
I mean, the great thing about interviewing is in terms of like the types of questions they're going to ask you and what they're still looking for in a candidate, that is all still the same. Everyone's still looking for people who can work as a team, people who can engage with others, people who are responsible and who are capable of on-the-job learning. Really, the main difference with interviewing virtually is that you really want to prep your technology beforehand and do a little trial run, see if you can do a trial run with a sibling or a friend or someone to make sure your technology is working, and then also have a backup. So in this era, most often your backup would be your phone if you're doing this virtually, and just have both options available to you. Oh, this is a great question. How can I
Yeah, I
hear?
love that of having a backup. I think that's so key. Yeah, you see this question pop up. So how can I appear professional in my interview when I'm in my bedroom, which many of us are in our homes right now?
Such a very timely and awesome question. So a great thing that you can do on Zoom, and my coworker does this from his home quite frequently, is you blur your background. So you actually don't see your bedroom in the background. You just see you and then kind of just a blurred out, like kind of like beige or white space if you're against a wall. It's just a Zoom function is to blur the background. You could also have like a photo background, like what's it called, Megan? Like there's a Zoom like template photo.
Like a virtual background,
like a virtual background, yeah. That might be a little bit distracting in terms of an actual interview where they really want to focus on you. Just a blurred background, if you could be at like maybe a beige or white wall, might be simplest.
Actually, and I think those are great options because I think a neutral background can be really helpful. Take some of that worry out. I have a colleague, well, we have a colleague who has an awesome ducks background. And I was like, what's your background? And he was like, oh, it's a shower curtain I bought online. So I think they're like, if you're kind of creatively minded, there might be some fun ways to
That's awesome.
Transform your space.
Yeah.
So I love that. Yeah, I'm going to ask you a question that's come up in a preview. It's not asked right now, but it's come up a couple times in previous workshops about students saying, I've done all this stuff and I know I kind of have to sell myself, but I really feel uncomfortable bragging about myself.
Mhm.
what to do. And I think that can come from so many different places.
Mhm.
But yeah, any tips on that?
Yeah, so it is a very weird experience. Interviewing is probably the one time where you will spend the most time talking about yourself, and it is weird. We don't tend to do that in everyday conversation. I think a tip that I would use is see if you can pick others' brains about what would they say about you in terms of your strengths or your professional skills or your expertise. So, in some of my job searches, some of my most valuable help and tips have come from former coworkers who have said, "Oh, did you write this on your resume? You were so good at XYZ." Or, "Did you remember to include this experience when you worked at this place? Remember how that was such a success?" And sometimes you forget the cool things you've done, and you don't always know how to frame it in terms of what you want to say about yourself. So sometimes hearing what others would say about you can be really helpful.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that's what we have, and we're just right about up to our time that we have together today. Anything that you would like to share, Theresa, before we sign off?
I mean, they're already ahead of the game if they have great questions like this, so I'm very impressed.
Awesome. And this is something that Sale can help you with. If you reach out to us via email, we can get you connected to some resources, or if you want another set of eyes, we have lots of wonderful mentors. So please, if this, you don't want to do it alone. And if you have a college and career center at your high school, those are often really great resources. So I love your advice of just like, you just got to start. You don't have to wait until you have
Yep.
all of your experience, or yeah.
Yep. Your resume will never be finished. It'll always be growing. So you just have to start it.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today, both you, Theresa, and everyone who was watching and helping behind the scenes. And we will see you same time, same place next week.